Styllou Christofi entered this world in the early 1900s in a small, quiet village on the island of Cyprus, a place where life moved slowly and everyone knew each other's name, each other's family, and often each other's secrets. The air there carried the scent of dry earth and olive trees, and the rhythm of life was shaped by survival rather than comfort. Poverty was not unusual. Hardship was not rare. It was simply life. People woke before sunrise, worked with their hands, and slept with tired bodies and heavy thoughts. And it was in this world that a little girl named Styllou began her journey, a journey that no one around her could have imagined would one day echo far beyond that quiet village. From an early age, there was something about her that people noticed, though they could never quite explain it. She was not loud, not playful in the way other children were. She did not run freely through the fields with laughter trailing behind her. Instead, she watched, she observed, her dark eyes often fixed on things longer than expected, as if she were studying the world rather than living inside it. Other children laughed easily, but her smiles were rare and brief, like fleeting shadows that appeared and disappeared without warning. Some people simply thought she was shy. Others quietly believed there was something deeper behind her silence, something they could not see but somehow felt. As she grew older, life did not become easier. Like many women of her time, her path was not shaped by dreams, but by duty. She married young, stepping into a role that was expected of her, becoming a wife and eventually a mother. The responsibilities came quickly, and with them came the weight of expectation. She cooked, she cleaned, she cared for her family, and she endured. There were no luxuries, no moments of escape, only the endless repetition of survival. Each day blended into the next, and over time, the years passed not with excitement, but with quiet endurance. But beneath that ordinary surface, something was slowly forming. Life had not been kind to her. Struggles, disappointments, and the constant pressure of survival began to shape her inner world. Hardship does not simply pass through a person. It leaves marks. It leaves scars that cannot be seen. And sometimes, those scars grow quietly, feeding emotions that remain buried beneath the surface, invisible to everyone else. As the world around her began to change, so did the direction of her life. Her son, like many young men of his generation, dreamed of something more. He dreamed of opportunity, of escape from the limitations of village life. England, especially London, had become a symbol of possibility, a place where a person could rebuild their future, where survival could turn into success. Eventually, he made the decision to leave Cyprus behind and travel to England, carrying with him hope, ambition, and the belief that his life could become something greater. For Styllou, this was both a moment of pride and a moment of quiet fear. A mother's bond is powerful, and the idea of her son leaving, of him building a life far away from her, created a silence inside her that words could not fill. But time moved forward, and distance became reality. Her son began his new life in London, in a world completely different from the one she had always known. Eventually, she followed him. When Styllou Christofi arrived in London, she stepped into a city that felt like another universe. It was the early 1950s, and London was still carrying the scars of World War II. Buildings stood beside empty spaces where destruction had once lived. The streets were filled with movement, with strangers who passed each other without acknowledgement. The sounds were different. The language was different. Even the air felt different. For someone who had spent her entire life in a small, familiar village, London was overwhelming. She did not speak English fluently. She did not understand the culture fully. She existed in a space where she could see everything but feel connected to nothing. Isolation is a powerful force. It does not make noise, but it slowly changes a person from the inside. She depended on her son, depended on his presence to give her stability in this strange new world. He was her connection, her anchor, the one familiar thing in a place that felt cold and distant. To outsiders, she was simply an elderly immigrant woman, quiet, unremarkable, invisible in the endless motion of the city. People passed her without a second glance. No one stopped to wonder what thoughts lived behind her silence. No one stopped to see the years of hardship, the emotional weight she carried, or the quiet storm that was slowly forming beneath the surface. Because the truth is, people often believe danger looks obvious. They believe darkness announces itself. They believe they can see it coming. But sometimes, darkness lives quietly inside an ordinary person. Sometimes, it hides behind routine, behind silence, behind the face of someone no one would ever suspect. And in the crowded streets of London, surrounded by millions of lives moving forward, no one could have known that this quiet woman from a distant village, this mother, this invisible presence, was slowly moving toward a moment that would change everything, a moment that would transform her from someone forgotten by the world into someone the world would never forget. When Styllou Christofi settled into her son's home in London, the arrangement may have appeared ordinary from the outside, just another immigrant family trying to build a life in a city that was still recovering from war. But inside those walls, something far more fragile was taking shape. The house was not large, not luxurious, just a modest space where three adults attempted to coexist despite differences that ran deeper than language or culture. Her son stood in the middle, balancing two worlds, the old traditions of his mother and the new life he was building with his wife, Styllou Christofi. And it was in that delicate space between past and present that tension quietly began to grow. At first, the disagreements were small, almost invisible. A comment about how food should be prepared, a look of disapproval over how the house was arranged, a quiet criticism about habits, routines, or decisions. These were the kinds of moments that many families experience, the subtle friction that comes when generations collide. But in this house, those moments did not dissolve. They lingered. They settled into the air like dust that no one bothered to wipe away. For Styllou, the change was difficult to accept. In Cyprus, she had understood her role clearly. She had been the authority in her home, the matriarch, the one whose voice carried weight. But in London, she was no longer the center. She was dependent. She relied on her son for language, for stability, for belonging. And now there was another woman beside him, another woman influencing him, shaping his daily life in ways she could neither control nor fully understand. Styllou Christofi represented something new, something modern. She had adapted more easily to England. She spoke the language better. She understood how things worked. She was building a life with her husband that did not revolve around the old traditions Styllou clung to. And even if Styllou never intended to create conflict, her very presence felt like a threat to the older woman. Jealousy does not always appear loudly. Sometimes it disguises itself as concern. Sometimes it hides behind the belief that one is simply protecting family. Styllou may have convinced herself that her objections were reasonable, that she was defending her son from influence she did not trust. But deep inside, something more personal was unfolding. She felt replaced. She felt sidelined. The bond she once had with her son no longer felt exclusive. He had someone else to confide in, someone else to prioritize, someone else whose opinion mattered just as much, if not more. Every shared meal became an unspoken battlefield. Silence at the table felt heavier than words. A glance between husband and wife could trigger suspicion. If her son laughed with Styllou, it felt like distance. If he defended his wife in a small disagreement, it felt like betrayal. These moments stacked on top of each other, forming a quiet resentment that grew stronger with each passing week. The cultural gap only widened the divide. In Styllou's mind, family loyalty was absolute. A son belonged first to his mother. Marriage did not erase that bond. But in England, life followed a different rhythm. Independence mattered. Couples made decisions together. The authority of parents slowly gave way to the autonomy of marriage. This shift was not just uncomfortable for her, it felt like an erosion of identity. Isolation added fuel to the fire. She had no friends in London, no familiar community where she could release her frustrations. She could not easily step outside and speak her language with neighbors who understood her worldview. Her world had shrunk to the walls of that house, and inside those walls her thoughts echoed louder each day. When a person has no outlet for emotion, it turns inward, it festers, it magnifies small problems into large ones. Perhaps Styllou sensed the hostility. Perhaps she tried to maintain peace, but even small attempts at kindness can be misinterpreted when trust is already broken. A suggestion could feel like criticism. A simple correction could feel like disrespect. The distance between the two women stopped being about daily disagreements and started becoming something more personal, more emotional, more dangerous. Styllou began to see patterns that may not have existed. If her son spent more time with his wife, it confirmed her fear. If he disagreed with his mother, it reinforced her belief that Styllou was turning him against her. Each ordinary interaction became evidence in a case she was building silently in her mind. And once a narrative forms inside someone's thoughts, it becomes difficult to break. What made the situation more volatile was the lack of open resolution. There were no long conversations that cleared the air, no emotional confrontations that ended in understanding. Instead, Tension simmered quietly. Words were swallowed, grudges were stored, and the emotional distance between mother and daughter-in-law hardened into something cold and unyielding. Over time, resentment transformed into something sharper. It was no longer just discomfort. It was no longer just jealousy. It was anger, a quiet, controlled anger that did not explode outward, but instead settled deep inside. And anger, when left alone long enough, begins to look for justification. In Styllou's mind, Hella was no longer simply different. She became the obstacle, the reason her son felt distant, the reason she felt powerless, the reason her life in London felt so unbearable. Blame is powerful because it simplifies pain. Instead of facing loneliness, displacement, and the loss of identity, she could focus her frustration on one person, and that focus became dangerous. The house that once symbolized family unity slowly turned into a space divided by invisible lines. Every step, every conversation, every shared room carried tension that no one outside could see. To neighbors, they were just another immigrant family adjusting to life in post-war London. There were no dramatic scenes spilling into the streets, no loud arguments that drew attention. Everything remained contained. But inside, something was shifting. The emotional distance between the two women was no longer repairable. What began as ordinary friction had evolved into a quiet hostility that grew stronger each day. And when resentment is fed long enough, when it is allowed to mature without interruption, it does not simply disappear. It waits. It waits for a moment of weakness, a moment of opportunity, a moment when emotion overrides restraint. And as the days passed in that modest London home, the tension that had once seemed manageable was slowly transforming into something irreversible, something that would soon push Styllou Christofi beyond the point of return. The night of July 29th, 1954, did not begin with chaos. It did not arrive with thunder or warning. It slipped in quietly, like any other night in that modest London home, where the air felt still and the world outside moved on without the slightest awareness that something irreversible was about to unfold. The streets were calm. The city lights glowed softly against the darkness. Inside the house, everything appeared ordinary. And yet, beneath that fragile calm, a decision was forming. Styllou Christofi was awake. While the rest of the house drifted into sleep, she remained alone with her thoughts. The silence of night can be dangerous for a restless mind. Without distraction, emotions grow louder. Memories replay themselves. Grievances sharpen. In the darkness, resentment often feels more justified, more urgent. For weeks, perhaps months, tension had been building inside her, but that night it felt different. It felt settled, focused. She may have replayed every argument in her head. Every moment she believed her son had chosen his wife over her. Every look that felt like disrespect. Every silence that felt like rejection. When anger is repeated enough times in the mind, it stops feeling like emotion and starts feeling like truth. And truth, even when distorted, can push a person toward action. The house was quiet enough to hear the faint sounds of breathing from behind closed doors. Shadows stretched along the walls. The floorboards, old and worn, knew every step taken across them. And sometime in those late hours, Styllou rose. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no final argument that pushed her over the edge in that exact moment. What makes this night so chilling is its stillness. She moved through the house deliberately, calmly, the kind of calm that does not come from peace, but from decision. She made her way toward Hella Christofi's room. Hella was asleep, unaware of what was approaching her in the dark. There was no chance to prepare. No moment to defend herself. What happened next was sudden and violent, breaking the silence that had wrapped the house just moments before. Styllou attacked her daughter-in-law with brutal force. It was not a struggle filled with prolonged resistance. It was swift, driven by bottled rage finally unleashed. The woman who had once appeared quiet and withdrawn was now acting with terrifying determination. Hella did not survive the attack. In the aftermath, there was no immediate scream echoing into the street, no neighbors rushing in. There was only the heavy stillness that follows violence, a stillness thicker than silence, filled with the reality of what had just been done. For a brief moment, there must have been awareness that nothing could be undone, that a line had been crossed permanently. But instead of surrendering to panic, Styllou shifted into something else, control. If the act itself was fueled by emotion, what followed required calculation. She understood quickly that the truth could not remain visible. If the death appeared as murder, suspicion would be immediate. So she attempted to create a different story, a different explanation. something that could hide the violence beneath something more chaotic, more accidental: fire. It was a desperate and dangerous choice, but in her mind, it may have seemed like the only path left. She set the scene, arranging events in a way that would suggest tragedy rather than intent. When flames begin to spread, they erase details. They consume evidence. They transform clarity into confusion. Perhaps she believed that fire would hide everything. But fire is unpredictable. Once lit, it does not remain obedient. It moves, it grows, and soon smoke began to rise, creeping through the house, seeping into the night air outside. What may have started as an attempt to cover one crime began threatening something even larger. Neighbors noticed. Smoke curling into the sky does not go unnoticed in a tightly packed London neighborhood. Alarms were raised. Emergency services were called. Firefighters arrived quickly, their presence slicing through the darkness with urgency and flashing lights. Water met flame. Chaos replaced stillness. Inside the house, the fire was extinguished before it could completely consume the scene. And that detail would prove crucial, because when the flames died down and the smoke cleared, what remained did not tell the story of an accident. Investigators entered the charred space, expecting to find the aftermath of a tragic fire. Instead, they found signs that suggested something else, something deliberate, something violent. The condition of Hela's body did not align with death caused solely by fire. There were injuries that could not be explained away by smoke or flames. The more closely authorities examined the scene, the more inconsistencies appeared. The narrative of an accidental blaze began to unravel almost immediately. Suspicion did not take long to settle, and in that fragile space between discovery and accusation, Styllou's attempt to control the story began to collapse. Fire had not erased the truth, it had exposed it. What makes that night so haunting is not only the violence itself, but the quiet path that led to it. There was no explosive public meltdown, no dramatic escalation visible to outsiders. There was only resentment that had matured in silence, isolation that had deepened without interruption, and a mind that had slowly convinced itself that removing one person could solve everything. But violence rarely solves anything. It only multiplies consequences. As authorities pieced together the timeline, as questions sharpened and evidence mounted, the events of that night could no longer remain hidden behind smoke and ash. What began in stillness ended in investigation. What began as private anger became public crime, and by the time the sun rose over London the next morning, the house that once held quiet tension had become the center of a tragedy that would soon capture attention far beyond its walls. The decision made in the darkness could not be reversed. The line had been crossed, the damage had been done, and from that night forward, Styllou Christofi was no longer just a silent immigrant mother living in post-war London. She was a woman who had committed an act that would place her name into history for reasons no one could have imagined when she first stepped into that city years before. When the flames were finally extinguished and the smoke began to thin, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a scene suspended between destruction and revelation. Water dripped from blackened walls. The smell of burning wood and scorched fabric clung to the air. Firefighters moved methodically through the structure, ensuring no hidden embers remained. What had begun as a frantic emergency response was slowly shifting into something else: quiet observation. At first glance, it could have passed as a tragic domestic fire. Post-war London had seen its share of destruction. Buildings had burned before. Accidents happened. But trained eyes notice what panic overlooks. And as officials examined the remains inside, small inconsistencies began to surface. The body of Styllou Christofi was discovered amid the damage, but something about the scene did not align with a simple fire fatality. The positioning, the injuries, the timeline. There were signs that suggested violence had occurred before the flames ever took hold. Fire leaves its own distinct marks, and investigators could see that not all the wounds matched the story of smoke and heat. The shift from accident to suspicion happened quietly. Police began asking questions. They spoke to neighbors first, people who had noticed the smoke, people who had heard nothing unusual before the fire began. No one reported a loud argument that night, no screams that echoed into the street. The calm before the blaze seemed almost unnatural. Then they turned their attention inward, toward the only other adult present in the house when the fire broke out: Styllou Christofi. She maintained composure at first. Shock can look like stillness, grief can look like silence. To an outside observer, she appeared as an older woman who had just endured a terrible household tragedy. But investigators are trained to look beyond appearances. They asked simple questions at first. What time did she go to bed? When did she notice the fire? Where was her son? What had happened earlier that evening? Small details did not line up cleanly. Her account of events felt fragmented. Certain explanations lacked clarity. And as forensic examination continued, the physical evidence began telling a story that contradicted her version entirely. Authorities determined that Hella had suffered fatal injuries before the fire was set. The flames had not caused her death. They had been an attempt to conceal it. That realization transformed the entire investigation. This was no longer a tragic accident. It was a homicide. Once suspicion crystallized, the questioning intensified. Under pressure, cracks began to form. Maintaining a constructed narrative requires consistency, and consistency becomes harder when confronted with undeniable evidence. Every answer had to align with physical proof, and as the gaps widened, the illusion of innocence grew thinner. Eventually, Styllou Christofi was arrested. The image of a quiet immigrant grandmother being taken into custody stunned those who knew the family. To neighbors, it felt almost surreal. She had never been the loud or disruptive presence on the street. There had been no public signs of volatility, but the truth was no longer deniable. The investigation had shifted from uncertainty to accusation. As the case moved forward, the weight of what she had done began spreading beyond that burned house. The press took interest. A domestic killing combined with attempted arson carried a grim gravity, especially in 1950s Britain. Society at that time still carried a strong image of women as caregivers, as moral anchors within the home. A mother committing such an act disrupted that narrative deeply. It unsettled people not only because of the crime itself, but because of who had committed it. The legal process unfolded with careful scrutiny. Prosecutors presented forensic findings that demonstrated premeditation and concealment. They outlined how the fire had been deliberately set after the fatal attack. The sequence of events was reconstructed piece by piece, transforming that silent night into a clear timeline of action. Throughout the proceedings, the central theme remained undeniable. This had not been chaos spiraling out of control in a single, explosive moment. There had been intent. There had been an effort to erase evidence. Fire had been used as a tool, not as an accident. Styllou's defense could not easily dismantle the physical proof. Motive, while rooted in domestic tension, became increasingly clear to the court. The strained relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law was examined. Testimony highlighted the hostility that had simmered inside the household. What had once been private emotional friction was now dissected publicly. And as the trial progressed, the image of that night sharpened in the minds of jurors. They did not see a confused elderly woman caught in an unfortunate accident. They saw deliberate action followed by deliberate concealment. The law required clarity, and clarity is exactly what the evidence provided. Outside the courtroom, the public followed the case with intense interest. Post-war Britain was still redefining itself, and high-profile criminal cases captured national attention. Newspapers described the shocking details, emphasizing both the brutality of the act and the cold attempt to destroy proof through fire. In the end, the verdict reflected what investigators had concluded from the start of their deeper inquiry. Guilty. The attempt to hide the crime had failed completely. Fire, intended to erase, had instead illuminated the truth. What she may have believed would dissolve into smoke had solidified into evidence. The very act meant to obscure responsibility became one of the strongest proofs against her. The consequences now moved beyond investigation and into punishment. As sentencing approached, the reality of her actions became inescapable. There was no alternative narrative left to construct, no further concealment possible. The system had done its work. The truth had been established. What stands out most in this chapter of the story is not just the crime itself, but the unraveling, the belief that destruction could rewrite events, the assumption that flames could cleanse guilt. Instead, every attempt to cover the truth only deepened the severity of the outcome. The house that once held quiet resentment had become a symbol of failed concealment. The smoke that rose into the London sky that night had signaled more than fire. It had signaled the beginning of exposure. And from that exposure, there was no retreat. By the time the legal process concluded, Styllou Christofi was no longer shielded by silence or by the anonymity of immigrant life. Her name was attached permanently to a calculated act that began in anger and ended in irrevocable consequence. When the guilty verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom did not erupt into chaos. There were no dramatic outbursts, no cinematic confessions. Instead, there was a heavy stillness, the kind that settles when everyone in the room understands that a life has just changed forever. Styllou Christofi stood there as the words were spoken, words that formally declared her responsible for the death of her daughter-in-law and for the deliberate attempt to destroy the evidence with fire. In that moment, the long path from silent resentment to public conviction reached its final legal turning point. In 1954, Britain, the punishment for murder was clear. Capital punishment was still the law of the land. There were no lengthy appeals stretching decades into the future, no automatic stays that delayed the inevitable for years. Once sentenced, the machinery of justice moved forward with steady, procedural certainty. And for Styllou Christofi, that meant one thing: death by hanging. The weight of that sentence carried a different kind of shock. She was not a young criminal hardened by a lifetime of violence. She was an older immigrant woman, a mother, someone who once seemed almost invisible in the streets of London. The image clashed with the reality of the crime. Newspapers highlighted that contrast again and again, the grandmother figure standing at the center of a brutal domestic killing. Society at the time still held tightly to the idea of women as nurturers, protectors of the home. Her conviction disrupted that expectation in a way that unsettled the public deeply. As she was taken from the courtroom and transported to prison, the final stage of her life began in confinement. Prison strips away routine, strips away identity, leaving only time and consequence. Days move slowly behind locked doors. Silence becomes louder. Reflection becomes unavoidable. Whether she felt regret, denial, or cold acceptance is something history can only speculate about. What is known is that the law offered little room for reversal. Her case drew attention not only because of the crime, but because of what it represented. At that point in British history, executions were becoming increasingly controversial. Public opinion was beginning to shift. Debates about morality, justice, and the effectiveness of capital punishment were slowly gaining momentum. Yet those broader societal conversations did not alter her fate. She had been sentenced under existing law, and the law would be carried out. In December 1954, inside the walls of Holloway Prison in London, preparations were made. Executions in Britain were conducted with strict procedure. They were not public spectacles. They were controlled, methodical, almost clinical in their structure. The condemned would be informed of the final date. Clergy would often visit. Formalities would be observed. Then, at a scheduled hour, the sentence would be fulfilled. Styllou Christofi walked the final steps of that process as one of the last women in Britain to face execution. When the moment came, it was swift. Hanging, by design, was intended to be quick. And just like that, the life that began in a small Cypriot village more than half a century earlier ended inside a London prison. Her execution marked more than the end of an individual life. It placed her name into a narrow historical category. Among the final women executed in the United Kingdom before capital punishment for murder was eventually abolished in the 1960s. That fact alone ensured that her story would not disappear entirely. Legal historians, true crime writers, and researchers looking back at the final years of capital punishment would encounter her case again and again. But beyond the legal milestone lies the human story, and that is where the tragedy deepens. A woman born into hardship, shaped by displacement and isolation, allowed resentment to grow unchecked. A family fractured not by dramatic events at first, but by slow, emotional erosion. A single violent night that destroyed not one life, but two: Hella's through murder and Styllou's through consequence. And in between, a son who lost both his wife and his mother to the same chain of events. When people look back on cases like this, they often search for a clear explanation, a simple motive that neatly justifies the outcome. But human behavior rarely fits into clean categories. Jealousy, cultural conflict, isolation, pride, anger, these forces rarely operate alone. They blend together, amplify one another, and sometimes push ordinary people toward extraordinary acts of destruction. The story of Styllou Christofi is not one of a lifelong criminal mastermind. It is the story of how unchecked resentment can harden into hatred, how emotional isolation can distort perception, and how a single, irreversible decision can eclipse an entire lifetime that came before it. History does not remember her for her years of survival in Cyprus. It does not remember her for raising a son or enduring hardship. It remembers her for one night and the fire that followed. And perhaps that is the most sobering part of all, how quickly identity can collapse into a single defining act. In the years after her execution, Britain moved steadily toward abolishing the death penalty for murder. Public sentiment evolved. Legal reforms followed. Today, her case is often discussed within that broader historical shift, a reminder of the era when the state still carried out executions and of the kinds of crimes that led to them. But beyond the legal context, the emotional echo remains. A quiet woman once overlooked by society became a headline. A family dispute escalated into irreversible violence. An attempt to hide the truth only ensured it would be exposed more forcefully. And in the end, justice, as defined by the law of that time, was delivered with finality. From a small village in Cyprus to a prison cell in London, the arc of her life feels almost surreal. Yet it unfolded step by step, choice by choice. And when the final chapter closed inside Holloway Prison, it did not simply end a case. It sealed a cautionary tale about anger left unchecked, about the danger of letting resentment define reality, and about how one decision made in the silence of night can echo through history long after the flames have died out.